Hello there. So we have arrived at the Exodus, what's called the Exodus, one of the two big E's of the Old Testament. The Exodus is the first one and the exile is the second one. So the Exodus happened somewhere around about 1450 BC. There are differences about the dates. Scholars are always arguing about dates, but it's close enough. And for the Exodus period, once they leave Egypt and they are in the wilderness, they've crossed the Red Sea, they're in the wilderness. That period of history is covered by 4 books. And this is where it's quite difficult to fit them all in together, perhaps the beginnings of our difficulties. So Exodus 12 to 40, chapters 12 to 40, the whole of Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy all fit into this period of the wandering in the wilderness. 40 years because when they first went to the borders of the Promised Land and they sent out the 12 spies to have a look, 10 of them came back with a negative view. Although the land looked wonderful, it looked very well defended and very strong. And the last thing they wanted to do was to go into the Promised Land. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, came back with positive viewing. They saw the same difficulties, the same power of the resident tribes and peoples of the land, but their view was that if God told them to go in, there wouldn't be a problem about conquering the land. So God's judgment for that disobedience was that they would spend, that the generation that had felt like that would die in the wilderness, and that took 40 years. So they have 40 years wandering in the wilderness. While they're in the wilderness, God gives them the instructions for the tabernacle and for all the religious rites, all the sacrifices and the laws that they would need when they move into the Promised Land. You have to bear in mind that they had been for 430 years in Egypt, ruled by other people, and in the latter years, slaves. So to go from that to running their own country and their own affairs and to looking after their own homes and farming and so on, when all they were used for in Egypt was for brick making and building pyramids and things, it was a very big transition for them. And the laws are wonderful. Deuteronomy is simply a second giving of the law. It's a review of what happened in the wilderness. So quite a lot of it is repeated what happened in Exodus, the chapters in Exodus, but very interesting to read and important to read because there are bits that are not in Exodus that are in Deuteronomy. And Numbers is talking about the tribes. Now we need to think about this because they were tribal groupings, family groupings. It started off with the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Israel. They were called the children of Israel because they were 12 sons. And each family group, which grew and grew and grew, was named after the first son from that family in the descendants of Jacob, who was renamed Israel. There is a slight exception to that, and that is that the tribe of Levi was never going to get any territory in the Promised Land. The tribe of Levi was chosen by God to be the priestly tribe, to look after all the affairs to do with the tabernacle, the place of worship for God, all the artifacts and everything. Different descendants of Levi were to have specific roles in the care of the tabernacle and the transportation of the tabernacle in the wilderness, and they were to be priestly members in the Promised Land when the Promised Land was settled, and they were not going to have a tribal area. All the other tribes were given an area of land that was that tribe's area of land. So Judah, Benjamin, and all the others, Issachar, all the others would have areas. So we have now 11 tribes because Levi is not going to have a territory. It's not a territorial tribe. And Joseph, although he was one of the sons, he was second to youngest, Benjamin being the youngest of the children of Israel, also did not have a tribal, his name was never a tribal name. And what happened was his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, became tribal leaders instead of Joseph. And this is one of the reasons why often when they're referred to in scripture, you get the passage will say the half tribe of Ephraim or the half tribe of Manasseh, because they were the two halves of Joseph that became tribal names as they settled in the promised land and they had their own areas. So there was adjustments made to the allocation of land when they got there. So they travelled around the wilderness, and they were given the law, the 10 Commandments, the law as well, and all the rules and regulations for the tabernacle. And Leviticus is all about the rituals for sacrifices and so on. And all of that is very important to understand as they come through. Now they encounter, as they travel through the wilderness, the descendants of other people that have been mentioned early on in Genesis. They meet the Moabites, and they meet the Edomites, and they meet the Philistines. And quite often you find, and we found it actually in the life of Abraham, that he at one point was confronted by an association of 5 kings, local kings. And this is something else we have to understand about this period of time, that where we think of nations being really very large territorial areas, back in those times of Abraham and Moses, they was more like city-states. But then if we talk about cities, that sounds like London and New York and Tokyo. But the cities of those days were more like large towns rather than big conurbations and cities. And each of them had a leader that was called a king. Now, that king would have been king of that large town or small city, that large town. And the people who belonged to that king, they would farm the land around the city, around the town. And the town would have fortified walls all the way around it. And at night time, people would come inside the walls for protection. And the king ruled over that large town, small city. So that's the sort of setup that there was. So don't get the impression when you see 5 kings having an alliance and standing out against someone that you've got an enormous area of land all agreeing to fight together. It wasn't like that. We're talking about large towns with a ruler who was called a king, who might be a little bit more like the mayor of a town as we would see it now. So we come to the death of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, at the end of Exodus as well. Moses and Aaron, his brother, and Miriam, they all die. They don't go into the promised land. Joshua, who's been Moses' assistant for most of the time in the wilderness, all the time in the wilderness actually, Joshua takes over from Moses and is called, and the book of Joshua deals with Joshua's story. And that the history carries on from there. And the whole Joshua is simply all about how they settled in the land, how they took the land, the problems they had with the different fortified cities, Jericho and Ai and other places. So we have that period of conquest of Canaan, which probably took the best part of 200 years to accomplish. We don't have exact dates for that at all. So they invade Canaan, they move in, and as they settle, and Joshua dies, we come to the period of the Judges. The book of Judges talks about the period of the Judges. This was a very unsettled period. They were in the land, but they were very vulnerable to the tribes around them. And the trouble is that without Joshua and Moses and Aaron, without these great leaders, and they are settled in tribal areas, they don't have that unity of purpose of following the Lord. And the book of Judges tells us all about, it's a kind of circle in Judges. You get the people forgetting about God, just getting on with everyday life. They didn't have a central place of worship. The tabernacle was in the land, but it wasn't a place they all went to, like the temple in Jerusalem later on was. And so there was a lot of, yes, they did have the Levites all round, settled in the different towns, but they drifted away from God. They forgot his laws. They didn't do what they were told to do. They ignored things. They got into trouble, and God allowed other nations to attack them in different areas. And when they realized that they were under attack, they cried out to God for help, and God sent them judges. And there are a lot of judges in the book of Judges, and they were called judges, but what they were people who led the people of the children of Israel, the descendants of Israel, led them in their fight against different nations that invaded them. And when that fight was over, the people recommitted themselves to God, and everything settled down, and they had a period of peace. And then, as time went on, they got slapdash in their behaviour and their following of God, and another enemy would come in. And there are a whole lot of judges. Principal ones are Othniel, Ehud, the left-handed Benjaminite. He's an interesting character. Not many verses about him, but it was significant that he was left-handed. And then there's Shamgar and Barak and Deborah, the one woman judge, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. And it's in this period of the Judges that Ruth appears. The love story of Ruth and Boaz,